The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
Welcome back to Security and Compliance Weekly, episode 29. We've been talking to Ann Cleaveland from the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, which is out west in Berkeley. Johnny, if you want to put up the photo. I mentioned in the first segment that Berkeley is famous for being the place where Cliff Stahl, author of The Cuckoo's Egg, got his had his whole experience, and I got a chance to meet him 2 years ago at a conference. I guess it was last year at a conference, so that was kind of cool. Before we jump back into our discussion, where Anna's going to go into more details about this research report that they produced and introduce us to the idea of dynamic tensions when we look at cybersecurity. Before we do that, do have a couple announcements. Layer 8 conference is going virtual. The conference is still going to be held on Saturday, June 6th, and Security Weekly listeners can still save $20 off their ticket by visiting layer8conference.com and using the promo code SecurityWeekly, all one word, before selecting your ticket type. Please consider supporting Layer 8 or one of their partner organizations by purchasing a ticket. And as a bonus, some of the Security Weekly team is actually going to be hanging out in our own channel on the Layer 8 Discord server, because we've got Discord on the brain right now, apparently. We'll be there to hang out, answer questions, just riff with you guys, and maybe some of us will participate in some of the contests. So come on over to Layer 8 on Saturday, June 6th. Also, if you want to learn about how hidden vulnerabilities can lead to application compromise, you can do so by tuning into our next webcast with Sneak.io. Register for our upcoming webcasts or virtual trainings by visiting securityweekly.com/webcasts. And as always, you can also visit securityweekly.com/on-demand and view any of our previously recorded webcasts. All right, let's get back to it with Ann. I did want to ask you a brief question before we jump into the report, and maybe it's a segue, I don't know. I hadn't had a chance to look ahead to the future the way Matt had. I guess that's more on your website. I was focusing more on the report. I'm curious, specifically, do you see PCI being around 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or more generically, is there still a role for compliance, or what is the role of compliance in the big picture looking ahead 5-10 years?
Well, let me look in my crystal ball, Jeff. And I will say in some ways that is an unfair question, because our future scenarios really are not about predictions. They're about trying to gain some foresight. But certainly, I think that the role of compliance is only growing, right? With GDPR and the CCPA, these things are so early in their implementations.
And so an adjacent question to that, I think, which is probably a little more relevant, as we see the need to protect data and the integrity of data, as we think about machine learning and artificial intelligence models, data provenance becomes a very important component. Does that fall under federal or state regulatory guidelines? To Jeff's point, maybe it's not PCI, which is industry specific, but definitely we could see some regulatory angles here to really put some safeguards in place of that data. Does that make sense?
I think it does. And from what we're seeing where we sit right now, kind of this hands-off approach to the technology industry in general, at least in the US, where it was sort of there's the phrase permissionless innovation, seems to be waning. So I think we are going to see a lot more both, federal and state interest in regulating, data specifically, but other issues around cybersecurity as well. California has an IoT law now.
Right. Yeah, and we're seeing them in overseas too. The UK was implementing some regulations around consumer IoT devices and capabilities that they needed. So I could see very similar things coming to the States at some point.
So, that all of this notwithstanding, and we could just keep riffing on tangents, but I do want to take a look at the report. So tell us very briefly about the research you guys did that led up to this report, and sort of frame what you produced in terms of findings and recommendations, please, Ann.
Absolutely. And cut me off if you want to drill deeper into anything. But I'll say at the highest level, we were interested in finding out what is the state of the art in board governance of cybersecurity and where is that going? And this was driven by a pretty simple insight that I know you all have talked about as well on this show. Cybersecurity is not just a technical challenge, but a human and organizational and cultural challenge as well. And as cybersecurity has become a larger and larger part of enterprise risk at organizations, boards have taken a much deeper interest and role in that organizational and cultural piece. So I'll start to talk and drill down a little bit into the findings, but I just would say, one note about why this actually matters and why it was interesting to us. Board governance is an increasingly important factor and determinant of how well we as a society and an economy do in improving cybersecurity outcomes. So if you can kind of pull the lever of improving board governance, at thousands and thousands of companies, you've really made an impact on the long-term health of the digital ecosystem. So Jeff, should I just dive into kind of what the findings were?
Yeah, the findings, and if the best way is to sort of start with the four questions you asked, and at least introduced the idea that you weren't looking and I'm not sure, refresh my memory if this was an hypothesis going in or a finding coming out, that this whole idea that it's a sliding scale, that there's this thing that you're calling dynamic tension involved in cybersecurity. And Johnny, now's probably the time to put up the graphic.
Yeah, so one of our hypotheses was that there is not yet a best practice out there that everybody could simply adopt. Boards, and what we heard was boards wish that there was a best practice, but by and large, they agree that's not likely to be possible anytime soon, just given how rapidly, regulatory, competitive, and threat environments are evolving. That isn't to say that there isn't good practice, but there isn't a best practice. So board governance of cyber risk becomes about building a process to ingrain oversight at a higher and more precise level than most boards are currently doing. And in building that process, this is where I get into the findings. What emerged from talking to board members was that boards are grappling with four fundamental questions around cyber risk. And we represent these as four dynamic tensions, which is what the audience is looking at on the webcast slide right now. And again, these four dynamic tensions emerged from four big questions that we heard board members were grappling with. And I think before I get into what each of the tensions represents, I'll also just say, to your point, Jeff, it would be easy to interpret each of these lines on the slide as trade-offs, but they're not trade-offs. They're actually continua along which, different boards in different industries, kind of under different, compliance regimes, to go back to your point, will legitimately choose different answers. So these are continua upon which reasonable people can disagree. What is important is for, any individual board of directors to know where they are on these tensions and know where their colleagues on their board are on these tensions, so that they are all optimizing for the same things and all sort of have the same objective function. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, it makes so far, and it's interesting, and I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back or anything, but when I first came out into the private sector 25-ish years ago, and it was the beginnings of the internet, and internet security is what we called it back then, and companies were just getting on board with plugging in and attaching their networks to the internet. The company that I worked for, we put together this idea, and it's not unique, of security being sort of a life cycle, that again, this theme of a continuum or a continuous process. And we tried to stress even back then to the customers to, it wasn't as important to figure out, where you want to be as much as it is figure out where you are. There is no end point, in other words. It's not a, start here at point A and get to the finish line. It's this continuous cycle, and it's more important to, just find out where you are in the cycle, so that you can, put your best foot forward and focus the right area. So, if nothing else, this is reinforcement that maybe we were onto something 25 years ago, and it just never really stuck that well for whatever reason. Like, we weren't really good at explaining it to people or something.
Jeff, the problem was what you were on. I mean, that caused the explanation problems to happen.
That shirt alone, Jeff, explains it all.
That's true. Back then, I wore a tie, but it was paisley. I will say that.
Yeah, no, but Jeff, that resonates a lot with the way we've thought about this framework, and it sounds really simplistic, but being self-aware really is the first step.
Well, and what I like about this, Ann, is that you start with the thing I talk about a lot, which is the risk model, right? This is a risk discussion at the end of the day. And what you've laid out here is that there's traditional enterprise risk management approach, right? Risk reward, how much risk am I willing to take to drive business? And then the other side, which is more of a safety issue. I came out of nuclear power. I spent time doing oil and gas. It was more about safety than it was about, some of the enterprise risk reward discussions, right? So every organization, every industry has its different tensions around what is driving the overall risk model, which then feeds into your other three areas really nicely, I think, because based on your risk model, that's going to identify how and who you want to go bring in as your CISO, right? From a cultural alignment, which then drives some of these other aspects in your model. And I think by doing this at the risk level, I think it's so important for people to understand the board has to decide with executive management how it wants to address the risk discussion in the organization, and then everything comes after that. I think a lot of people do it more from the bottom up, and that's where we run into issues.
Yeah, and what we heard when we talked to board members about this specific continuum about the risk model is, the people who leaned more towards the, hey, cybersecurity is just another piece of enterprise risk management, were really concerned with just the opportunity costs of investing in mitigating cybersecurity risk versus all of the other risks that, as a board member, you're concerned with. Whereas the people who are more on the existential and safety side of the spectrum often would cite supply chain risk. I think one board member described it to us as, supply chain risk feels like an org chart that exists in another dimension on another plane. And it's just really hard to wrap your head around it. And that was sometimes the source of where that existential risk piece came in.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, supply chain is a very interesting dynamic to the overall risk equation, especially nowadays when we think about the environments that we're in, right? Where our supply chain is potentially limited in what it can get us from keeping certain businesses going, right? A lot of people think of that very differently than like core cybersecurity risk.
Yeah.
To your point, it doesn't matter whether it's top down or bottom up with how you approach it. The main issue in almost every organization is communication, whether it's communication from the board down into the weeds or the weeds up to the board, right? You need to have a clear asset picture of what your profile is and your tolerance and your acceptance rates before you can make a decision, a strategic plan, or a mitigative structure to deal with it. Right?
Yeah. And, since we published this report, we've had, the audience for this was intended to be boards of directors, but we've had CISOs come back to us and say, hey, thank you. I've actually been using this with the rest of my executive team to try to frame up for our board or our audit committee specifically the kinds of discussions we want to be having and sort of what does the board expect, what should they expect, and therefore what should management be prepared to deliver. So I guess I'm just agreeing that it's a strong communication tool.
Yeah, like I went into the resilient governance for board of directors report PDF, right? And just did a contextual search for communication. It shows up 6 times in here, and each time that it shows up, it's based around what you just said. But the one part that's in here, right, that I want to read directly from it says, quote, that kind of communication does not scale readily and is subject to its own possible misinterpretations and distortions, right? So with the spirit of communication, how can the graphic that we just had up, how can the 4 dynamic tensions be misinterpreted?
Well, there are probably an infinite number of ways they could be misinterpreted, but I'll just go back to kind of the original point is that, the worst way they could be misinterpreted is if they were interpreted as trade-offs rather than continua along which there will be different clusters based on different industries, different sectors. And also, I think it could be misinterpreted if people thought that it was then static. So if you think, okay, where we land now is where we're going to land forever, versus, where you land on these continua should change as the world changes. And a really adaptive or resilient board is having a conversation, maybe annually about, are they still in the right place along the continua?
Let me ask a question in a different way. Not so much on this show, but very much on our flagship show, Policy Security Weekly. We very often refer to one of the big problems with organizations in general doing things well in terms of security based on their maturity. And we don't go into a lot of details necessarily, other than mature organizations do things right, immature organizations do things wrong, or don't invest in the right things, or don't focus on the right things, so on and so forth. How would you, to an audience that is attuned to or accustomed to thinking about the level of security or the success of a security in an organization based on its maturity, and they want to hear that in some way, shape, or form, how would you describe maturity of an organization based on how well they're receiving, absorbing, adapting, acknowledging the dynamic tensions?
Yeah, and so what we've heard since, this is actually a great plug, Jeff. What we've heard since we published the report from board members is, gosh, it would be really great if a maturity model existed out there. Is there a way that a maturity model could be built? And I think for the dynamic tensions role in that maturity model, again, the first step along kind of a maturity ladder would be to be self-aware among the board about where they fall along these tensions. I think the next step would be to become consensual and agree on, know where you are and agree that's where you should be. And then again, as you move along a kind of maturity ladder to being more mature, which I would characterize as being able to adapt, and then being resilient, which of course means, coming back stronger from an incident, you would reassess these tensions against some things actually that we didn't hear in our research that we were surprised not to hear. And I think it speaks, overall to the fact that, a lot of boards really are just so focused rightly on defense that they haven't begun to focus in a more kind of mature, if you will, way on the upside of cybersecurity in terms of being a competitive factor, a differentiating factor, and the role in which cybersecurity can go hand in hand with innovation, can go hand in hand with trust, which you brought up before, and can go hand in hand in developing better relationships with regulators. So I'm not quite sure if that answered your question.
And all sorts of stuff. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. We actually, Scott and I, with Red Lion, our company, we actually almost always insist on meeting with sales and marketing because we're like, this is a competitive advantage. We'd like to be revenue neutral. Please let us help us be revenue neutral by making this a sales and marketing advantage. And the looks we get like, huh?
Yeah, we never thought of that. What do you mean?
Oh.
Well, I mean, and I think that's somewhere in the report in terms of, how do you use security as an enabler? How do you help security help the business? Johnny, can you put the graphic up once more? Because I want to illustrate, have it available to illustrate this, because I think this is an important point. If I'm hearing you correctly, Ann, there is no notion that maturity is inherently one direction or another on any of these particular continuums. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right.
Okay. So I think that's really, really important to hammer home to our listening audience and to your audience, to boards that you're dealing with or that you've been in communication with since the publication of the report. Maturity does not mean you're all the way to the right or all the way to the left. Maturity is more about self-awareness, knowing where you are, knowing you have a problem, knowing what the problems are. And in some ways, it sounds like they don't need a best practice. They almost there's been a couple times where the way we've framed this, it almost sounds like they need a 12-step program. The first step is understanding
only when dealing with PCI, Jeff. Only when dealing with PCI. Hey,
there are ironically 12 steps to PCI.
Well, there's 12.
And
anyway, I think that the best way to point this out is that every company has their own profile. Every company has their own mix of where they are on all of these spectrums. And that's fine. It's not good or bad. It's appropriate for you. And that's right. Ann, am I vaguely correct?
That's right. And I think back to the point about communication, you should know where you are and you should be able to describe the rationale for why is where we are appropriate for us. And once you can do that, that unlocks all kinds of things.
So
nicely
for those of you who are not viewing this on YouTube or some other medium where you can actually see the slide, what we're talking about is the 4 dynamic tensions. And the 4 tensions are the risk model, the expertise, the competition and cooperation, and the board CISO management protocol. And I want to ask you, and you can totally tell me that this has been asked. How did you come upon these specific tensions, right? Risk model, expertise, competition and cooperation, and board CISO management protocol. Like, what led you to these exact right here?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I'm glad you asked, because I want to be really clear that these tensions came directly from the research. So this is what the board members that we interviewed told us. I mean, they didn't all say it in these words, but as we, collated all of the interviews that we did with board members, these are the 4 things that they all talked about, that they were all grappling with.
Okay. And in the report,
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was going to say, in the report, you lay out the demographics behind who you interviewed and what, right? If I can, directly from the report, 20 board members, 9 of 11 industry sectors, from communication services all the way to information tech, which represent 52 board roles, 130 years of combined board experience, right? What made you go just with 20? Because in my mind, and I don't know if Matt, Josh, or Jeff share this. In my mind, 20 is a very small sample. Why did you keep it so small?
Yeah, you're exactly right. 20 is a small sample, and this research isn't done. What we'd like to do now is go back and survey, hundreds of board members to continue to deepen this, validate it, et cetera. But 20 really in-depth interviews, to get an initial sense of whether our hypotheses were true or false about, again, the motivating question, what can boards do to play a more strategic role, was the first step.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Scott, just a point, because we do a lot of sampling in PCI, and I'm certainly not a mathematician or a statistician. I don't have that expertise, but I have been fascinated over the years in investigating, what constitutes a valid sample, if you will. It's surprising how relatively few or small a sample set can still have statistical relevance, much more than most people would intuitively imagine. So 20, while it seems small, does not mean it's not statistically relevant. Good coffee.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. These were qualitative interviews. And I think just another thing to know about the people that were in the sample is, the folks that we talked to are some of the most thoughtful and sophisticated board directors that you will find out there on this topic, both in terms of the business acumen that you would expect of any director who is part of a large public company, but also many of them had really good technical credentials. So I guess my point is, the people that were in this interview group are not cybersecurity schmucks.
Mm-hmm.
Did you say cybersecurity schmucks?
She did.
I did.
She did.
Can we delete that out of the live stream?
We need that as a new title on the on the Discord. Hi, you've just been termed a cybersecurity schmuck. Thunk.
Yeah, how to talk to cybersecurity schmucks might be the episode title. But we will defer to your wishes.
So okay, let's get back on topic here. What you talked about going out and doing more with this, right? What's the next step for this? What is your plan? How are you going to expound on the initial assessment, and how are you going to drive thought leadership with getting this out? Like, what's your plan behind that?
Yeah, thanks for that. So there are a few components. One is, we'd like to turn this into a much larger scale survey. It could be something as simple as putting the dynamic tensions out there and asking board members to locate themselves along it, to see where do we see clusters in different industries, different size companies, et cetera. So that's one piece that we're really excited about. I mentioned previously that one thing we keep hearing boards ask for is a maturity model. So we're hopeful that there are ways that we can take this research further and help it inform a maturity model. And we've got some work underway to scope that. And then third, kind of back to the maturity model and the clusters point, we are looking for, so if you know anybody, we are looking for boards who would want to engage with us around this, kind of locate themselves on a cluster and, engage in a series of discussions or workshops to move along the maturity model, and help validate this for other boards out there.
Okay. Do you have specific examples of what you're looking for?
I think we probably we're looking not for a board who is already at the top of the maturity spectrum, if you will. So, as you guys know, probably the most mature boards around these topics are kind of Fortune 100 and financial services at the top of that. So really looking for a board that's probably tremendously motivated, but is somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
So everybody else.
Well,
outside
I think I can speak for my co-hosts, right? And say that if you pass us the survey, we will fill it out to give you the best information that we've collected over years of experience in dealing with not only boards but also organizations. How's that?
Really appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. Take you up on it.
Yeah. There's some board members
certainly
we can pass it to. That's not a problem.
I was going to say, we probably know a few board members here and there, or we have customers.
Just a few. Just a few.
Yeah.
And maybe we can collaborate, and in a future episode of Security and Compliance Weekly, we can come back with sort of phase 2 of the results, or I'm just thinking out of the box now. Maybe we can have like a panel discussion and talk a couple board members into, coming on and talking about their experience and what they're seeing and how they're benefiting from this work. Hopefully it's benefiting.
I'd be really interested to see this report varianced against a blue ribbon report coming out of NACD, right? And to take a look at the findings and do a contrast and compare about, what is seen in one place is not the other, right? And to be able to give that point counterpoint,
Right.
It'll be interesting.
It will be interesting. So, hopefully we can work something out along these lines, and look forward to future collaboration. Our time is about nigh for the day. So Ann, really want to thank you on behalf of all the co-hosts and myself for responding to our request to come on the show and be a part of this. And you get to go down in the annals of history of being the first live stream guest on Security and Compliance Weekly. So congratulations.
Well, it is an honor to be the first live stream guest, but genuinely thanks to you for having us. I hope this was useful to your audience, and we're thrilled to be able to talk to people more about this research.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Thank you. And that's going to do it for today. And look forward to a future episode talking dynamic tensions, and it won't just be Rocky Horror Picture Show. For that, we will call it a wrap for Security and Compliance Weekly, episode 29. Stay safe as you venture out into the world again. Until next time.